Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum all my dear friends and English literature aspirants. This is your host Yeoman and you're watching MA English Part 1 and 2 Notes. Today we are going to study a prologue to the Canterbury Tales written by Geoffrey Chaucer. I'm going to share the character sketches of the Pilgrims. These character sketches are very important and I want all of you to just note down the key points of each character so that you can memorize the character traits of each character. Character sketches of the Pilgrims. Students, you must learn the character traits of each character so that you will be able to recognize them when they are given in the reference to the context question. So let's start with the character sketches. The first one is the knight. Knight जो है अमूमन सोल्जर को कहा जाता था, यानी सिपाही को. ये 14th सेंचुरी की बात है, द ईयर 1400. और इसमें आप नोट कर सकते हैं ये उसकी पिक्चर आ रही है द नाइट की, कि उसकी अपीयरेंस कैसी होती थी. Knighthood is a medieval institution associated with feudalism and chivalry which distinguished the nobility from the common people. Knighthood flourished on the European continent, especially in France, and spread to England with the Norman conquest, reaching its height with the 12th century, tending to dwindle with the advent of the Elizabethan age. As a page, a boy at 7 joined the household of his father's lord or of some great noble, bishop, or king. Here he learned to handle weapons that were small versions of those he would use when he grew older. He also learned the code of courtesy and behavior expected of a knight. Then a boy began his training as a squire at 15, यानी वो पहले squire बनता था. He acted as a valet or person servant to the knight who was his master. He set the table and stood behind his master's chair at meal times. The squire received serious training as a mounted soldier. He rode with his master into the battle and helped him in many ways. In battle, the squire wore silvered spurs to distinguish him from a knight whose spurs were gilt. Of course, knightly behavior was synonymous with decent moral conduct. The knight was henceforth to be champion of the church, the righteous and implacable enemy of the infidel, the compassionate protector of the weak and oppressed, the defender of all right and justice. The knight was a worthy and brave man. वो एक काबिल एहतराम शख्स था और बहुत बहादुर था, having fought well for his king as well as for Christianity. His skill in battle was well known in several lands, both Christian and heathen. He had a naturally traveled widely in the course of his military career. He was respected everywhere for his honorable behavior and had often been given prestigious position of sitting at the head of the table. Chaucer lends a romantic air to the knight by giving a list of the places where he had campaigned. The mention of the far-flung cities and countries like Alexandria, Lithuania, Grenada, etc. give a sense of added adventure, mystery, and romance to the knight's career as a soldier in the defense of his land and faith. A brave soldier, he had killed many in single combat. He had also won several distinctions. उसने बहुत सी जंगें लड़ी थी और उसमें वो कामयाब लौटा था. वो एक बहुत बहादुर सिपाही था. Brave and courageous though he was, the knight lacked the boastfulness and arrogance which is commonly associated with successful soldiers. But then he was a representative of the chivalric code. Further, he was endowed with several virtues. He was not only brave, he was wise. 2. He was modest as a maid, says Chaucer emphatically. He had loved chivalry, honor, truth, and courtesy all his life. He had never uttered a single rude or unkind word to anyone. He had an unfailing tenderness towards the feeling of others. He was devout, besides being a brave defender of his country and faith. He had vowed to go on the pilgrimage to Canterbury, and as soon as he could do so, had set out to fulfill his vow. Thus he had not been discarded his battle dress. He had come straight from his campaigns abroad to join the company on the pilgrimage. Chaucer sums up the knight in words, he was a very perfect gentle knight. ये वो बहुत perfect gentle soldier था. Chaucer adds a few details of appearance, dress and equipage. The knight had good horses. He was dressed in a tunic of coarse fustian, which was decidedly the worse for wear. The stained gippon or doublet spoke of the campaigns from which he had made his way directly to join pilgrimage. The knight does not care much for personal appearance. He nas not gay. In the knight, we have an example of Chaucer's art of characterization. Realistic details are combined with the ideal ones. Typical traits intermingle with individualistic ones. The knight becomes a type, an individual, and universal all at once. The knight is typical of the chivalric class, brave, wise, just, and generous. At the same time, he is modest as a maid. The trait at once typifies him as an ideal worthy knight of the Middle Ages and individualizes him as a Chaucer's knight. His sober aspect and his taking along only one servant with him on the pilgrimage mark him as an ideally modest and gentlemanly person. The individual details are given through the description of his stained tunic. He is the very essence of chivalry, ever ready to spring to the defense of the weak, oppressed in all times and lands. वो जो नाइट था वो अपने यूनिफॉर्म में ही आ गया था, जंग से लड़ता लड़ता वो डायरेक्ट उसने पिलग्रिमेज को ज्वाइन किया था और उसने कपड़े भी नहीं चेंज किए हुए थे, उसका ट्यूनिक स्टेन था. इंपॉर्टेंट यूनिवर्सिटी क्वेश्चन हैं, ये देख लीजिए. व्हाट इज़ द सिग्निफिकेंस ऑफ द नाइट अमंग द कैरेक्टर्स ऑफ द कैंटरबरी टेल्स? कंपेयर एंड कंट्रास्ट द नाइट विद द पर्सन इन द प्रोलोग. The next character sketch is of the squire. He seems to be a young person, riding his horse very skillfully. He's dressed very nicely and his horse is also very much decorated. So let's read about his character now. The squire's good qualities, inspired by love of his lady and by his courtly breeding, are more secular naturally than by his father's, contrasted on a basis of affinities. The knight and the squire are the first of Chaucer's peers among the pilgrims. They are both idealized representatives of the same military class. The son a likely candidate for the order of knighthood, in which the father is already so eminently consummate. But they are representative also of two different stages of life. The youth, fashion, grace, exuberance, and promise of the squire altogether contrast with the knight's maturity and experience, his long record of achievement, his concentration of essentials like good horses and prompt thanksgiving. The squire too represents the chivalric class. He offers a striking contrast to the knight in appearance. A young, handsome lad of 20, he is lively, gay, and brightly dressed. We are given graphic details of his appearance. His hair was curled as if it had been laid in a press. Uske baal curly the. He was of an average height and had a well-proportioned body. He was strong and agile. He had given a good account of himself in battle. His record in fighting made him hope to win his lady's favor. वो ladies को impress करना चाहता था. He was a passionate lover who slept as little as did the nightingale. We see the youth of the squire reflected in his brightly embroidered dress, which had flowers of red and white and looked like a meadow. He was as fresh as the month of May, sums up Chaucer succinctly. The squire is adept at drawing and writing. He played on the flute or sang in a gay voice all day long. He could write poetry, compose songs, dance and joust. He is a well-accomplished young man. He did his duty by his father the knight. He carved or cut the meat at the table before his father. Thus he too, like his father, is a humble, dutiful and courteous. Chaucer's squire is obviously trying to qualify himself for knighthood. वो चाहता था कि वो knighthood के लिए qualify कर जाए. इसमें वो सारी खूबियाँ होती थी जो उसके father में थी. Chaucer combines typical individual and universal traits in the squire as he does in many of the other characters. The squire represents the youth of all ages in the carefree, gay and fresh countenance in his zest for life. At the same time, such a squire must have been a common picture in the England of the 14th century. He presents the fashionable young man, a lusty lover, well accomplished in the arts as well as in battle. He also typifies the chivalric code of behavior. He is made an individual in his colorful dress, average height, and curly hair. We notice that some of the details used by Chaucer to describe the squire are at once typical, individualistic, and universal. The next character sketch is of the yeoman. He was a servant to the knight. He had only one servant, this yeoman, sitting on a horse, riding it skillfully. You can see his picture on the screen. So let's move on towards his character. The ideal yeoman is a typical, pure, and simple. In Chaucer's time, the word yeoman meant a servant or an attendant, also performing the function of a forester, concerned with game rather than with the preservation of the forest. And so this yeoman wore a green hood, bright green being the huntier's color. He carried a sheaf of bright and sharp peacock feathered arrows under his belt. Chaucer shows his keen powers of observation in having noticed that the forester in those days carried a sword, a buckler, a dagger, a horn, and of course the mighty bow. This yeoman could handle his equipment with great efficiency. His arrows did not droop in their fight and did not fall short of the target. The yeoman's hair was very short and he had a brown face. He understood woodcraft thoroughly. A silver medal of St. Christopher shone upon his breast. So this was the character sketch of Yeoman. The next character is of the Prioress. You can see her on the screen that she is riding the horse. Let's read out her character. Although the Prioress is a woman of religion, being a superior nun holding the charge of a priory, she is depicted here as possessing a number of secular and worldly accomplishments. In fact, a nun has to live under vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The first convent for women was found in Egypt about AD 320 by the sister of Saint Pachomius. In England, the first convent was started by the Adbald King of Kent in 620 at Folkestone. Chaucer ironically says that the prioress was full of charity and pity, the qualities expected from a religious person, but the illustration which Chaucer gives of her charity and pity concern not human beings but her pet dogs, lavishly fed with roasted meat or fresh cow milk and fine hot bread. She wept bitterly if any of her dogs died and was hit cruelly by somebody with a stick. This prioress charity seems to us more or less misdirected because in those days people even never got enough to eat. Similar ironic implication is found in the way the prioress spoke French fluently when there was no real need for anyone in the England of 1387 to speak French. The irony concerns her secular aristocratic association. Then the prioress was very particular in the manners to be observed at meal times. She never dipped her fingers deep in her sauce. No trace of grease could be seen on her cup when she had sipped any drink from it, because she would wipe her lips clean. She picked up her food in a well-bred manner. She tried her best to follow the behavior prevalent at the royal court. In all this, Chaucer suggests that there was much affectation both in the prioress' religion and in her fine manners. Chaucer emphasizes the prioress' basic femininity. She was simple and sweet in her smiling, her greatest oath being merely by Eligius. These were several 14th century romances in which the heroine's name was Eglantine, which is also this prioress' name. Thus, in this description also we have an ironic association of the religious and the worldly names. Her wimple was neatly pleated. She had a well-shaped nose and glassy grey eyes. Her mouth was very small, soft, and red. There is a touch of humor in the reference to her fair forehead, which was almost a span of about 9 inches in breadth, because surely she was not undersized. Chaucer gives an ambiguous quality to the brooch which she wore with the inscription, "Love conquer all." The inscription refers to the love of God as well as to the love of the secular world. She is not greatly concerned over the suffering of her fellow men. Chaucer's prioress is gentle, demure, aristocratic in a worldly and culpably mindful of the life beyond her convent walls. यानी वो उसको दुनियावी ज़िंदगी में ज़्यादा इंटरेस्ट था और उसको कोई सरोकार नहीं था कि बाहर की दुनिया में क्या हो रहा है, किस तरह से लोग सफ़र कर रहे हैं. Important university questions. It is in the presentation of the Paris that the most delicately poised irony is apprehensible. Discuss what effects of comparison and contrast does Chaucer achieve by placing the character sketches of the Lady Prioress and the monk beside each other. The next character sketch is of the monk. You can see the picture of the monk on the screen. He's also riding a horse. So let's move on towards his character. Monk is a man who has taken religious vows and retired from worldly life to live with other monks. The first group of Christian monks organized in northern Egypt early in the 14th century. The members lived by themselves but met at fixed times for worship. They studied the scripture, prayed, and thought of God. Many orders of monks now exist, especially in the Roman Catholic Church. All the monasteries of one order follow an identical rule of life. In any such order, the monks take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Chaucer's monk does not hesitate to leave his cloister when it suits his pleasure to ride out in his fine clothes on his glossy grown palfrey. Even though his old and somewhat narrow rule expressly forbids a monk to go outside the confines of the monastery, he cares nothing for the requirements and duties of monastic life. He is reckless. Chaucer's monk rides abroad instead of laboring or studying as Austen did. But why should this fine gentleman, asked Chaucer ironically, make himself mad with work or study? The monk has the right idea, for who indeed can serve the world if he, an important lord, remains in his monastery? All very well for the long dead Austen, let the toil be reserved for him. For the living, there are the delights of hunting to be enjoyed by a monk who loves them and does not give a pulled hand for the tax that says that hunters are not holy. जी, बाइबल में लिखा हुआ था कि हंटर्स होली मैन नहीं होते, लेकिन इस मॉन्क को कोई परवाह नहीं थी और वो अपने शौक़ को पूरा करता था, हंटिंग के शौक़ को. Chaucer's monk, whose name we later learned to be Dan Pierce, has seen to it that his handsome mount is fittingly caparisoned for the journey. He is a complete hunter, the precursor, or right. All his pleasure lies in tracking and hunting the hare, for which he will spare no cost. He keeps greyhounds as swift as birds in flight and many valuable horses. Even the horse he has chosen to ride to Canterbury is a sleek, shiny palfrey as brown as a berry, and probably one of his hunters. Chaucer's monk is in truth a friar, a fair for the mastery, a manly man, a lord, a precursor, or right, a fair prelate. ये सारे textual quotes हैं. He is fit to be an abbot of some great monastic house, and he has already attained the position of prior of some cell or smaller dependent monastery. Chaucer's monk was an outrider who loved hunting. Hunting was indeed this monk's favorite pastime, and he did not hide his irritation with those who objected to it. He did not give a plucked hand, we are told, for that tax according to which a monk who disobeyed the rules of the cloister was like a fish without water. Chaucer's monk did not confine himself to his cloister, did not pore over hooks, and did not work with his hands. He defied St. Augustine's directive that physical labor was necessary for monks. This monk did not believe that the world could be served either by hard study or by hard labor, and therefore he could well have said, let St. Augustine have his work reserved for himself. He kept swift greyhounds for hunting purposes. All his pleasure lay in tracking and hunting the hare, and to enjoy this pleasure he spared no cost. The worldliness and fine living of this monk are greatly emphasized. The monk's costume and equipment were most lavish. He had a large number of valuable horses in his stable. When he rode, the jingling of the bridle of his horse could be heard at a distance. His sleeves were lined with grey fur from the squirrel of a finest quality. In order to fasten his hand under his chin, he had an intricate pin of wrought gold with a love knot at one end. He wore supple boots. His face shone as if it had been ointed. He was fat and in very good shape. Like his horse, he was not pale, like a tormented ghost, and a fat swan loved the best of any roast. Next sketch is the Friar. You can see the picture of Friar. He's riding his horse. He's carrying a stick. Let's read about his character sketch now. The Friar is a general name applied to members of religious orders of men who originally lived only by begging or as mendicants and had no possessions or fixed place to live. In England, the friars were popularly named after the color of their habits, robes, aside from the prioress, whose flower-like name have been chosen for her merely because it seemed appropriate. Brother Hubert is the only one of the pilgrims at the table who is named in the journal Prologue. Chaucer's Hubert pays rent firms for the exclusive begging right in his district. Friars, who were limiters, evidently found it a profitable business. John Gore, 1330 to 1408, English poet famous for his Confessio Mantis, Confession of a Lover, 1390, and William Langland, 1332 to 1400, English poet famous for his Piers Plowman, both speak in familiar disparagement of limiters. All three authors, Chaucer, Gore, Langland, satirized every limiter's immoral relations with women, and Brother Hubert is, of course, no exception. He is notorious for the prostitution of the young girls of his limit. Not only young girls, but wives too must guard their virtue against Hubert, who knows how to insinuate himself into every household with his flattery, dalliance, and fair language. His presence and jollity. Hubert is aware just what trinkets are dear to a feminine heart, for his tippet is always full of them. वो जानता था कि जो फीमेल्स हैं उनको क्या चीज़ें पसंद हैं और उसका हैट हमेशा भरा होता था टिपट से. इस फरार का नाम ह्यूबर्ट था. Chaucer's Friar was a gay and merry fellow. As a limiter, the Friar was allotted a particular area in which to operate, that is to beg. The Friar paid for the right to be in his area in which no other Friar was allowed to beg. By this time, religious begging had become a profitable proposition. With his characteristic irony, Chaucer tells us that in all the four orders of friars in England at that time, there was no one capable of so much gossip or so much flattery as this particular individual. Continuing his ironical manner, Chaucer says that this friar had performed a large number of marriages of young women at his own cost because they had been his mistresses, that he was a noble pillar of his order, that he was familiar to all the rich farmers and also to the worthy women of the town. This friar was, we are told, authorized by a papal license to hear confessions. Most sweetly did he hear a confession and grant an absolution. He promptly gave penance when he knew that he would get a good remuneration. If he got enough money from a sinner, he would boldly assert that the sinner was repentant of his sins. He was of the opinion that sinners, instead of shedding tears of repentance and offering prayers, should give money to the poor friars. This friar did not think it fitting to a worthy man like him should become acquainted with lepers. Such an association would have brought him no profit. Therefore, he thought it much better to deal with rich people and with sellers of food. He was courteous, says Chaucer ironically. His reading of the gospel was so pleasant that he would manage to rob even a destitute widow of some little money. The proceeds of his begging were much larger than the rent he paid to his convent. On Love Day, this friar was very helpful. He settled disputes by arbitration and made money by the service thus rendered. Although this friar was immoral and corrupt in his ways, Chaucer is able to establish the friar's humanity and even his popularity. This Chaucer does by pointing out the friar's love of music and song. यानी वो म्यूज़िक भी बजाता था और गाना भी गाता था ये friar. The friar had a merry voice. उसकी आवाज़ बड़ी मीठी थी. He could sing well and play on a fiddle. वो गाना भी गा सकता था और म्यूज़िक इंस्ट्रूमेंट भी बजा सकता था. In singing, he easily took the prize. In the course of his playing on a harp, his eyes twinkled in his head in the same way as do stars on a frosty night. Next character sketch is of the merchant. You can see his picture on the screen that he's riding a horse. He's well dressed up and his horse is also decorated. Let's read about his character now. Chaucer says that his elegantly attired merchant is a worthy man, but he does not know his name. वो कहता है कि वो वर्दी इंसान था लेकिन वो उसका नाम नहीं जानता था. Medieval merchant, those men engaged in the wholesale traffic of wool, hides, cloth, iron, and tin, were also the bankers and moneylenders of the nation. Rich and poor, proud and humble, even the king himself, all felt the power of the merchant who exploited the wealth of England and who now indirectly controlled the national purse strings. Chaucer's merchant is also typical in that he defies the civil wall and deals in foreign exchange. This unscrupulous merchant illegally carried on a thriving trade in foreign money. The merchant is depicted by Chaucer as a typical businessman who expressed his opinion in most solemn manner, always claiming and increasing in his business profits. In other words, he talked mostly of his commercial enterprises. Not unlike some businessmen of today, being an exporter probably of wool and hides, he was naturally anxious that the shipping routes between England and the Netherlands be kept open by being properly guarded at any price. Nor was this man quite upright in his business dealings. He had a knack for selling at a profit with the French crowns which he received for his goods. He also made a profit by lending money on interest. He conducted his bargains and borrowings with such dignity that no one ever came to know that he was in debt. यानी किसी को ये मालूम नहीं होने देता था कि वो भी loans में फंसा हुआ है. In spite of everything, this merchant was truly a worthy man, says Chaucer, with his tongue in his cheek. यानी वो satirically उसको कह रहा है कि he's truly a worthy man. Important university questions. What effects of comparison and contrast does Chaucer achieve by placing the character sketches of the merchant and the clerk beside each other? जी अक्सर पेपर में दो कैरेक्टर्स का कंपैरिजन आ जाता है, स्पेशली समनर या पार्टनर का और समनर या क्लर्क का. We are going to do the character sketch of the Clerk of Oxford. You can see his picture on the screen now. He is carrying books in his hand and he is riding the horse. The horse is not at all in a good condition. He is not decorated. The term clerk was applied in those days to any ecclesiastical student. Chaucer's Clerk of Oxford might be regarded as member of clergy engaged in advanced studies and the one who had not yet been appointed to a benefice, a post with remuneration. There is a suggestion that this clerk was not worldly enough to seek such an appointment, and the whole description of his character is based on this notion of dedicated scholarly unworldliness. यानी उसको दुनियावी कोई इंटरेस्ट नहीं था. Much of his study was devoted to the works of Aristotle, who occupied a large part of the university curriculum in those days. This sort of extended scholarship was financially difficult since a scholar had few ways of supporting himself except through gifts. Accordingly, we are told that this clerk had little gold in his coffer except what he might get from his friends. Just as the merchant stands first of the pilgrims from the world of business, so does the clerk among those from the learned professions. He stands first because he stands for the highest and best in learning. The pure ideal of selfless learning for its own sake and for the good of one's fellow man. His studies culminate in moral philosophy and he is evidently a true divine. Important university questions. Discuss Chaucer's attitude towards the knight and the clerk of Oxford. Knight और clerk में भी आप बता सकते हैं कि क्या फ़र्क है. इसका क्वेश्चन भी आ सकता है. The sergeant of the law is the next character. You can see his picture on the screen that he's riding the horse and he is dressed up in the lawyer's suit. His horse is well maintained. He has a lot of knowledge about worldly affairs. जिस तरह के आज के ज़माने में lawyers होते हैं, so he is the man of law. So let's read out his character. The sergeant of law is full of worldly wisdom. Legal learning in itself is much concerned with accusations, claims, and transactions arising out of men's worldly affairs. Along with the sergeant's knowledge of statute law and case law, Chaucer specifies his skill in drawing up a deed and in conveyancing, and also in founding an estate for himself by acquiring landed property. Chaucer does not question the ability of or the knowledge of his lawyer. Thus, this man could recite all the cases and judgments that had taken place from the time of William the Conqueror. In other words, this lawyer had extensive knowledge of the English case law. He could so draw up a deed or draft a document so well that no man could find fault with it. He could reproduce almost every statute. Chaucer certainly suggests that lawyer's failings. The lawyer was wary and wise, but it is his cunning, not his goodness, that is emphasized. Discreet he was and of great abundance he seemed, so his words were so wise. He had acquired a large number of robes and much wealth from his clients because of his knowledge and his high reputation. But we cannot help feeling that there was an element of fraud in his practice of law. No buyer of land as great as this law managed to acquire unrestricted possession of it, nor could anyone challenge his ownership of land in a court of law. Obviously, the lawyer did not acquire all his property by honest methods. We have another example of irony in Chaucer's statement that there was nowhere so busy a man as this lawyer, and that he seemed to be busier than he was. That is, he pretended to be busier than actually he was. As for his dress, he wore a motley coat, belted with a girdle of silk with small stripes, and he rode his horse in unpretentious manner. G. The next character is the Franklin. You can see his picture. He seems to be an old person riding his horse elegantly. He is carrying something as well. His horse is well maintained and in good shape. A Franklin was a free tenant of the crown, holding his hands without the obligation of military service or rent. A Franklin in the 14th century had come to mean a wealthy landowner of the gentry class. Chaucer's Franklin, in particular, must occupy a well-established and dignified position in his community because of the many public offices he had held. He is so carefully individualized by Chaucer that we feel his portrait must have been created entirely from one living model. Chaucer's Franklin had a white beard and a sanguine ruddy complexion. He might be regarded as the very son of Epicurus, who held that pleasure was the basis of perfect happiness. To live pleasurably was therefore his custom. He began his morning with a rich dish, namely a sup of wine. The finest food and drink were available in his house. He was so hospitable that he might be called Saint Julian of his country. Nobody had a better wine cellar than this Franklin. There was such an abundance of eatables and wines in his house that one would think that it snowed in his house of meat and drink. He changed his meals in accordance with the change of seasons. He kept many fat partridges in baskets and cultivated many kinds of fish in his ponds. His sauces were pungent and sharp, and the dinner table in his house stood steady all the day long. This Franklin presided at session of justice of the peace, had been a member of parliament, and had functioned as a sheriff and a treasurer. There was nowhere such a worthy vessel. The next character sketch is of the cook. The cook से आपको जाहिर है कि ये cooking करता था उनकी Pilgrims के लिए. He was a professional cook. He's also sitting on a horse. He's holding something in his hand and a cap in the other hand. His horse is also well maintained. Now let's move on towards his character. The cook is of middle class and has a cooking shop of his own. He is one of the churls. The 5 guildsmen had with them a cook in order to be able to eat good food on the journey. They took the cook with them in case of any deficiencies in the inns on the road. The cook was to boil the chickens with the marrow bones and prepare sharp tasting spices and flavors. He could roast and boil and broil and fry and make a stew and bake a pie. He was such an expert in preparing spiced chicken that he could equal the performance of the best. He was fond of drinking London ale. Unfortunately, he had an ulcer on his shin. The cook has been regarded as one of the most disreputable of Chaucer's pilgrims, though he is not so great knave as the pardoner or the summoner. The next character sketch is of the shipman. This is the last character sketch we are going to discuss. You can see the picture of the shipman on the screen. It's riding the horseback as well, and he seems to be a simple man. The shipman, the owner of a vessel called the Madeleine, represents an occupation rapidly gaining importance in Chaucer's century onwards. The sea and those who sailed on it become vital to England's interest. The shipman is presented as a greedy character. जी लग वो सिंपल लाया लेकिन असल में उसका करेक्टर काफ़ी ग्रीडी है. The men of West Country ports such as Dartmouth, from where this shipman came, had been issued a royal license for privateering against England's sea-going enemies, partly to protect English trade and partly to enrich themselves. The shipman is immediately identified by his inability to ride. He rode upon a horse as well as he could, that is, insofar as he was able to ride at all. He carried a dagger by means of a cord hung round his neck. Chaucer's remark that certainly the shipman was a good fellow is to be regarded as ironical, since it is immediately followed by an account of the way in which he was travelling. Dear students, today I have covered few characters, and inshallah I'll be covering more characters of the prologue to the Canterbury Tales. I hope you have understood the characters. Comment below if you have any sort of questions or queries regarding these characters. I'll be glad to answer you all. Till then, students, this is your host Yeoman signing off from M English Part 1 and 2 notes. Don't forget to like my video and also subscribe my channel for more informative and quality notes videos. Also press the bell icon for notifications so that you don't miss any video. Take care and Allah Hafiz.